We now have a fully operational database that's ready for us to use. We'll need a way to connect to our DB using the appropriate credentials that we hopefully establish when installing Postgres. While it might seem easy to just throw our credentials directly into our codebase here, somewhere in the server.js file or something like that, that's almost never a good idea. The number of times that large and small companies alike have accidentally committed sensitive credentials to a public Git repo is staggering at this point. And best practice dictates that we instead store this information as environment variables, and then provide that info to the environment running our application instead. Fortunately, we've gone ahead and installed the .env package, which means we can manage all of those credentials through a .env file in the root of our project. So go ahead and create two new files, .env and .env template, and open the gitignore file, and make sure that the .env file is never committed to Git. So we'll create that .env file and the .env.template file, like so. And in the .env.template file, let's add some stuff here. Let's say port equals 3001. Let's say database user equals Postgres. Database pass, short for password, equals also Postgres. Let's say database host equals localhost. Let's say database port equals 5432. And let's say database name equals wedding registration. And for now, just go ahead and copy those same values directly into the .env file. Starting from the top, we have a port that our actual API will be running on, port 3001. And then we have some Postgres related stuff here. We're defaulting the user to Postgres and the password to Postgres, which are standard defaults when setting up Postgres, though they might not work if you set your database up differently, or if your database owner is a different user. So go ahead and check those out and make sure that it works accordingly. Last, we have the database host, port, name, and we're running on localhost, port 5432, which is standard, and using the wedding registration DB that we already created. And so if you're able to connect to pSQL, you should be running on port 5432, but if you want to check, you can just go into pSQL and do something like this. Select name, setting from PG settings, where name equals port. And it should give you the port that it's running on, 5432, good to know. And again, if we had to name the database something other than wedding registration, for instance, we need to update the database name here as well. So each of these values corresponds to how we're going to connect to our database. And so how do we actually use these values? Well, we'll probably want to create another file to handle all of the config and to manage all configuration settings and import all environment variables and stuff for application. And so we'll do that, let's say Q, by touching a config.js file. And inside that file, we'll go ahead and format all of our environment variables appropriately and export anything we might need. So start by requiring the .env package and calling the config method on it. And then require the colors package so we can put some pretty colors in the terminal. Then let's go ahead and create a port variable here, which is the same thing, process.env.port. Does it exist? Make sure we use a number here of process.env.port. Otherwise, just use 3001. I'm using a simple ternary here to say, hey, does this port exist on process.env? Cool, make it a number, otherwise just use 3001. Then we're also going to create a function here, get database URI. And we're going to create a bunch of variables in here that we're going to use to construct our database URI. So we'll say const dbuser equals process.env.database user, or Postgres, just in case. Again, just adding some defaults here just in case. And we're going to do this for all of the variables. So this one will be dbpass, and dbhost, and dbport, and dbname. And the same thing here, database name, database port, database host, and database pass. Now, this one is actually a little interesting because it's usually a good idea to at least encode URI for the database host or for the database password, because sometimes those passwords can be a little funky and not accepted, especially if you're running on Windows, for instance. So we'll just use, again, a ternary here to make sure that if that password does exist in the process.env, that we will encode it. Otherwise, we'll just use Postgres. This will default to localhost. This will default to 5432. And this we will default to wedding registration. And so then we will return, well, let's just say like if the database, let's just say someone provides a database URL environment variable, use that. Otherwise, create, let's just go to the next line. Otherwise, create the DB connection string ourselves. And make sure I can type correctly. So we'll say return process.env.database URL. So if they supply a database URL, just use that. Otherwise, we're going to construct it ourselves. And a database URL usually looks like this. First, we have the driver, which is PostgreSQL, the type of database. And we have DB user, colon, DB pass, at, DB host, colon, DB port, slash, DB name. Now, if that looks a little funky to you, don't worry, it is. But it'll make a little more sense when you actually see what it comes out to. Unless you want to do the calculation in your head, you might already know. Then let's just go ahead and console.log exactly what's going on here. So we'll say, hey, wedding, registration, config, and let's make it green. And the only reason we can do that is because we're requiring colors here. And so it'll make it a green. It'll make it green in the terminal. And then let's add some other stuff here. Let's say the port. And let's actually make that blue. And then we'll just say port. And then let's go into, let's also do the database URL or URI, whatever. Let's make that blue too. And then let's actually call the function get database URI. And then we'll just console.log dash dash dash. And we'll export them. So we'll say module.exports equals port and get database URI. I did it again, huh? There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so we have a config file now. And we haven't really gone over this, but we're looking at all of this process.env stuff here. And what exactly is process.env? Well, Node.js exposes the process object as a global variable. This one right here, this process object. And then it provides information about and control over the current executing node process. There's a number of attributes on the process object, though we're only really concerned with process.env, which contains information about the system environment that Node is operating in. Let's actually see what happens here when we console.log all of this by importing our config into our server.js and using the port variable that we've defined here. Ooh, let's actually also go into our git ignore and make sure that we ignore the .env file. And make sure it grays out here. Great. So we know that it will not be committed to Git. That is super important. Super, super important. Because here, this could be whatever. This is just some sample stuff. But when we actually deploy our app to production, we want to make sure that all of our sensitive credentials are in here. So this would probably be the dev stuff, and then this would be the sensitive stuff. And in fact, a lot of times in an environment template, you can just get rid of all of that. And then the user would be responsible for coming in here and filling all of that goodness in. So let's go ahead and go into our server, and let's require const port equals require, what is that, .config? Yeah. And then here, instead of using the port there, we'll get rid of that, like so. And then we will save this, and we will run our server. We'll say, oh, let's actually make sure to save this too. Save it. We'll say npm start. Fantastic. Okay, cool. So we see this. Wedding registration config. Oh, you know what? I don't like that color. Let's go back into our config. Let's make it red. Cool. Now it's clearly delineated from the Nodemon stuff. Wedding registration config, the port, and our full database connection string here. And then it also says server running at HTTP localhost 3001. Fantastic. So that's really cool. So it looks like it's working. We see the configs defined through our .env file, along with the constructed database URI we use to connect to Postgres. And again, like this, all of this is cool, but it's kind of interesting that where are these environment variables coming from? How do they work? If environment variables don't have to be set in the .env file, we can also set them directly in the terminal when we start our application. We do something like this. We could say port equals 9999 nodemon server.js. And now the port is 999 and our server is running on port 9999. So environment variables are just specific to the environment itself. The .env package just takes everything in the .env file and attaches that information to process.env. But if something's already set there, like we did here by setting it explicitly with port 999, .env will ignore that. And so we don't have to worry about that. If you actually want to see what's inside the process.env, we can come in here, we can just say console.log process. Oh, let's actually give it a name too. Process.env. Let's make that yellow. And then say process.env. Oh, let's actually just look at the keys. Let's just check out all the keys on process.env, because otherwise it's just going to be a huge object. And we'll say npm start. And so you can see there's a ton of stuff here that comes with process.env. All of these things here. And we're not really worried about most of them, but you can also see that it has the environment variables that we declared in the .env file. And so at this point, we have an environment set up. We're good to go. Let's do the git dance. Since we've made sure that the .env file is not being committed to git, let's say git status. Looks good. Git add dot git commit set up environment variables and config for project. And let's actually connect to Postgres next.